Good morning, or good afternoon rather, because we've slipped to a slightly later time. And welcome back to the Japan Society's weekly webinar. I am Bill Emmett, and I have the honor and pleasure, as you know, of chairing the Japan Society. I hope you've all had a good summer, despite all the restrictions we are living under. As you will imagine, we were preparing a new program of webinars for the autumn, but had not been planning to begin quite this soon, especially as in the UK it is a bank holiday week. But Shinzo Abe had other plans, which he announced to his cabinet, his nation, and the world just last Friday. So, a little like the contenders to succeed him, we chose to accelerate our preparations. A decade or so ago, we might not have done so. In those years between 2006 and 2012, when Japan changed its prime ministers 6 times in 6 years, I'm not sure we'd have rushed to organize a webinar each time the occupant of the Kantei changed. We could now offer a prize to all those of you who can name all 6 of those prime ministers in the correct order. Yet the fact is that the first of those revolving door prime ministers at that time, Shinzo Abe, became a rather different proposition when he regained office in 2012. As you will all know, he recently became the Japanese prime minister with the longest continuous service in office, beating his own great uncle, Eisaku Sato, and, as I wrote in my blog, if you add together his more than 8 years in all, with Sato's more than 7 and his grandfather Nobusuke Kishi's more than 3 years, it means that this dynasty has occupied the prime minister's office for more than 19 years, more than a quarter of Japan's whole post-war political history. But what is Shinzo Abe's legacy, and what and who might come next? The lower house election is due by October 2021, shortly after what we hope will have been the rescheduled Tokyo Olympics. Mr. Abe's term as leader of the LDP, which will now be completed by a successor, expires in September 2021. To discuss Shinzo Abe's legacy and to look into the future, we are privileged to welcome 2 perfectly placed speakers, one in Washington, DC, and one, we hope, in Tokyo. Tobias Harris is perfectly placed because he has achieved what all authors and publishers crave, namely excellent timing. His biography, The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan, which you will see on the bookshelf behind his shoulders, was published just last week, a few days ahead of Abe's resignation. Tobias is Japan analyst for Teneo Intelligence, having in 2006-07 worked in a DPJ Diet member's office and so taken a look at Japanese politics from the inside. Keiko Iizuka is perfectly placed because in 1 hour's time she will be broadcasting on NTV Satellite's nightly news about this very topic, the leadership race. Many will know Keiko from her 2 stints in London for the Yomiuri Shimbun, and her great experience following the political beat in Tokyo in between. She is now senior political writer for the Yomiuri, as well as the commentator on NTV's nightly 10 o'clock news. She will be with us, as I say, just for the first half hour, as she has to leave for the news bulletin straight afterwards. As usual, I'm asking each speaker to open with 10 minutes of remarks, after which we will have a discussion with, most importantly, your questions. We're going to open with Tobias Harris, looking at the past on Shinzo Abe and his legacy, principally. Over to you, Tobias, in Washington, DC.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Thank you, Japan Society, for hosting this webinar. This is actually the official start, I guess, of my virtual book tour from my basement. And it really is, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about this. So here we are. Unexpectedly, a year ahead of time, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has left office, and we are now in a position to really assess his legacy. And I would say even before he announced his resignation, I mean, it certainly seemed that he was not going to receive another 3 years in office. And so we were already in a position to start looking at his legacy and start thinking about what has he accomplished now as he reaches this, this milestone of passing his great uncle's record. And so I'll just focus briefly on what I think will be the legacy that people will look back for. And it's mixed. You have a leader who's in office for that long. It was unlikely that everyone was going to say this was an unheralded success on every front. But we can also say that he ended up being, I think, a very different leader than what people expected, certainly earlier in his career. And the ideologue he was as a young LDP member. But also, I think I don't think anyone would have expected when he came back in 2012, breaking, at the end of this string of the six turbulent prime ministers over those 6 years, that more than 7 years later, we would be looking back and saying, well, Abe is now this record-breaking prime minister who had this phenomenal stretch of time in office. And so here we are left looking back and saying, so what did he actually do? And the first thing I think actually comes down to that stretch in office, and that is political stability. And I think above all else, the fact that he did last that long after 6 short-lived governments changed how Japan thinks of itself and changed how the world thinks about Japan. That you actually, after this period where you did not have a government that could speak with the same voice from year to year for more than a year at the time, you all of a sudden had a government that was able to pursue a consistent agenda for that stretch of time. At the highest levels of the government, you had actually, not only did you have the same prime minister, but also you had the same chief cabinet secretaries, or the same kind of face of the government for that time. You had the same finance minister, Mr. Aso, for that stretch of time. You had this core leadership unit, and in some cases the people maybe changed jobs, but the people around Abe, it was basically the same team in the key positions for almost the entire stretch of his government. And that is a profoundly important thing. I mean, something that Japan, and certainly parliamentary systems, you don't always get that. I mean, you can look at different parliamentary systems and you're not necessarily going to get that kind of stability, not just in the premiership, but also just in the very, very top of government. And I think, so one thing you got out of that was, I think, a clear focus on economic policy, and the focus ebbed and waned depending on events. But there was a consistent application of stimulus, both monetary and fiscal, I think, for the duration of that government. I mean, there were times, with consumption tax hikes where the commitment to fiscal stimulus was less than absolute, but a focus on Japan needs to grow if it's going to deal with its problems. And while there's some talk about, well, it was just short-term growth and it ended as soon as the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and I think that's certainly true. But I do want to stress one thing, and that shouldn't be lost in sight when we're thinking about the economic benefits of the Abe years, and that is unemployment falling to record lows and staying there, and the jobs to applicants ratio being at an extraordinary high level across the country. And what that meant was that if you were a young Japanese person leaving school during these years, you were graduating to the best job market you'd seen in decades. And given that Japan is still a system where your shot at at having a comfortable life is getting a good job out of school, for millions of Japanese people, that is a phenomenal achievement. And I think it explains why he was actually extraordinarily popular with young Japanese for basically the duration of his tenure. That you look at polls, broken down by demographic, his popularity was highest among young Japanese. And you would think, well, why would this stodgy conservative enjoy support? I mean, I think you have to think about that. And that has a meaningful effect on the lives of many, many Japanese people. And so that is absolutely a benefit, and it was definitely an outgrowth of political stability. The other benefit of political stability I think you saw was in foreign policy. And you, again, had consistency and a consistent strategy over the course of his tenure. Now, first of all, what you had, most importantly, given Japan's longstanding relationship with the United States, was a commitment from day one that Japan had to do everything it could to keep the United States committed to Japan, of course, but also Asia militarily, politically, and economically. And a sense really from Abe that he would do whatever it would take to make that happen. And so during the Obama years, despite the fact that he and I think President Obama did not necessarily gel very well as leaders on a personal level, I think their administrations saw shared interests in each other, saw good partners in each other as administrations. They saw that they wanted similar things out of US-Asia policy. And then I think after some initial bumps related to historical memory and Abe's early efforts to show that he was going to speak his mind on historical issues, they found a way to work on those together. That I think by 2016 you had Obama and Abe exchanging visits to Hiroshima and Pearl Harbor. And I think taking this approach where we're going to talk about history, we're going to talk about moving past historical memory without finger pointing, without putting Abe in a defensive crouch. And I think that was a real achievement. I think from 2015 onwards, that effort really bore fruit. But then more than that, you had these two administrations that I think were on the same page about military cooperation. And so you had the US-Japan Security Alliance upgraded and a new sense of different roles and missions, new areas of cooperation announced in 2015. You had Abe exerting a tremendous amount of political capital to change the interpretation of the Constitution that would allow Japan to come to US defense in certain circumstances, and then changing the laws in 2015, which was this marathon diet session to make that happen in 2015. Abe also in 2013 changing state secrecy laws, which led to the first big protests of his tenure. I mean, Abe was willing to take domestic risks to make the U.S.-Japan alliance stronger, and that was really really central to his agenda. And another area he was willing to run political risk was on trade. And from 2013, he's elected as the head of an LDP that basically ran against a DPJ that was considering joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And 3 months into his tenure says, actually, I'm going to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the talks at least for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I'm going to make, this is important for Japan, and I'm going to make it happen. That was a major gamble, and it meant taking on members of his own party consistently over the next several years as that agreement was negotiated. And it meant overcoming some of the stickiest issues in U.S.-Japan economic relations, going back decades, cars and a number of different agricultural questions and finance liberalization and insurance. There are all these questions that have been very sticky between trade negotiators, and they took it on. And in 2015, they signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which does have this U.S.-Japan bilateral agreement kind of smuggled in within this multilateral framework. And that was a genuine achievement. I mean, it didn't get through the US Congress, but it did end up influencing the bilateral agreement you ended up getting during the Trump years. And that was a tremendously important commitment and something that Abe was willing to fight for domestically. I mean, and then related to that, of course, then you get a change of administration, you get a very different type of US president, one who had talked, to be generous, very skeptically about the US-Japan alliance for decades. And Abe gambles from the very beginning, the relationship with the U.S. is too important, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. And if that means, I'm going to build a personal relationship with Trump, and I'm going to go there right after the election, and we're going to play golf, and I'm going to invest on making sure, even if it doesn't, even if it means some of the more creative relationship building is put on hold, I'm going to do what it takes to defend what the U.S. and Japan have built during recent years and the achievements of the first part of his tenure. And he did that, even with a president who pulls out of TPP on day one of his administration. Abe keeps at it, keeps working at it. And that transitions, I think, to the next set of his foreign policy achievements, was that he achieved, it wasn't just about relations with the U.S., and it was a commitment to relationship building and building on, I think, a legacy of that Japan has had of being seen as a good friend to countries pretty much across, maybe we should say, the Asian littoral. So a lot of Southeast Asia, ties with India that go back a long way, ties with Australia that have been growing over the years. And Abe took those relationships that already existed, and I think you can say as he leaves office, and you see the sort of greetings and send-offs he's getting from other world leaders, particularly in the region. I mean, I think many countries came to look at Japan as a more active, more visible player in the region than it had ever been before. India, I think, is probably the most profound example, where you see politically, economically, militarily, there are ties between those two countries, these two Asian powers that did not exist with anywhere near the density that you see now. And yes, the Abe-Modi relationship was an important part of that, but I think there's such a broad commitment in both countries now to seeing that relationship continue, and whoever follows is going to have a lot to build on there. And you have the business, the private sector in both countries committed to that as well, and that's his deep glue. And so he built on that relationship, and now Japan looks like it's at the head of sort of a block of Asian middle powers. Is it a block to contain China? I mean, I think you can debate just how much that's the case, but it is, I think, a bloc that is offering a different vision of how Asia should function, a different set of rules for how Asia should work economically. There are security links as well to try to counter China's efforts at sea in the region. And all of that, I think, is going to continue going forward. Of course, his record on foreign policy wasn't all success. We can talk about some of the failures. I mean, he had a number of notable accomplishments that he wanted to achieve, and he wasn't able to follow through. And some of those failures are quite glaring. So it was not a uniform record of success. But if we want to talk about his legacy, that's a big one. And then I think the final area of achievement, I realize I'm running low on time, so I'm not going to go, I don't want to go too much longer. But I think it's related to this achievement in foreign policy, and that is he changed how the Japanese government worked. I think for good. I think you had this process of centralizing the Japanese state that preceded Abe for several decades, and Abe not only put in place the final missing pieces of that, which were, giving the cabinet more control over who the top bureaucrats are. So making sure that the government was going to cut across ministerial lines and going to set national strategy in foreign policy and in economic policy in a much more coherent fashion than you had ever seen. But you also, I think, now have the standard of an activist prime minister, what a prime minister can do with these powers that have been given to the prime minister. And that doesn't mean every subsequent leader of the LDP is going to enjoy the same control of the LDP that Abe enjoyed, which I think enabled him to use those powers. But now the standard exists. Now the standard is there that if a prime minister can control and master his party, he has the tools available in the prime minister's office in a way that never really existed before to navigate the 21st century and the challenges of the 21st century. He leaves a legacy of a lot of challenges unresolved, a lot of constraints on Japan's future. There's no question about that. But you have a premiership in the future that will be able to tackle those challenges with considerable authority more than ever before. So I'm going to leave there and pass over to Keiko.
Thank you so much, Tobias. That was wonderful. Gave us a very, very great broad picture. We've got lots of questions coming in, so we'll follow up some of the specifics afterwards. But I'm delighted to welcome Keiko Iizuka in Tokyo. I'm delighted to see you there. Thank you so much for sparing the time from your always busy evening with your television commitments. So over to you. What's the gossip in Nagatacho?
Yes, and that was a wonderful presentation, Tobias. Thank you. I will really like to read your book. But anyway, I'm going, and thank you for letting me participate in this interesting, very timely program. But I am now in the dressing room in an NTV headquarters and have to go in a little bit more than 10 minutes sharp. So I'll be very brief, but I would like to tell you from Tokyo that this competition game is already over. It's now decided that Suga will be next our prime minister. And as of today, everything has been already under the table, decided, and that a big alliance of major factions already decided. So it just counting the members of the Congress or the Parliament, Suga has already nearly 300 votes, and the majority is 268. So without the local prefectural or regional votes, that's 147. Suga is already has become, has made already won the vote or the leadership competition. So I would like to point out maybe three things very briefly. It's the why he won. Very quickly. It's one, maybe there are two major reasons. One is the change of heart of Abe, because Abe's, everyone knew that Abe's intention to, he was looking at Kishida to succeed him up until very, maybe this spring. But because Kishida did not perform, he was not a good presenter or a good controller on coronavirus disease, and so Abe and LDP Secretary General Toshihiro Nikai, he is the real kingmaker in this competition. So Nikai-san and Suga-san. Suga-san is the main key person today. But so Nikai-san and Abe-san, we believe that must have agreed at some point, maybe early summer, that Kishida-san is a little bit weak. So in order for the Abe's legacy to be succeeded or fulfilled later, especially as Tobias pointed out about the constitutional reform and coronavirus counter coronavirus measure, he needed a strong Abe needed a strong and strong successor. And both Ishiba and Kishida are not satisfactory. So it was so I would like to point out that this is a resurrection of factional politics of faction in LDP. So this leadership competition will officially start on the 8th of September. And this is the 1st of September, but it's all now over. So Suga will take the position of the successor of Abe. And what will Suga do? I would like to talk about next. Is that his biggest mandate is, of course, about how to tackle with coronavirus. So he will continue what Abe has laid out before he leaves. Last Friday, there was a press conference where Abe declared his resignation, his intention to step down, and also he released the whole package of to tackle with coronavirus. So Suga will succeed this policy of how to tackle with coronavirus, and with that big agenda, Suga will be sitting in the as a prime minister, Japanese prime minister, up until for 1 year, up until next September, which is the official end of the LDP president. So he will serve as the leader of the LDP for the rest of Abe's term. So that's 1 year. So the reason why the second I said that there were mainly two reasons for this quick end of the game. One is that Abe has changed his mind, and with politics of faction resurrecting. So that's one thing. And another is that people all know that Suga's first term will end 1 year from today. I mean, this month. So Suga's term, official term, is 1 year. So apart from Kishida and Ishiba, everyone else who were thinking of running for this competition just gave up, because there will be an official big full range competition next September, 1 year from now. So the biggest challenge for Suga, if he intends to run after, if he intends to remain as a prime minister after next September, he will have to first of all do a good performance in tackling with coronavirus. And another question, big question, is whether or not he will go for general election. That is a very big question for him. So because current House of Parliament's term will officially end next October, not this year, but next year, October next year. So the next Prime Minister who will be sitting will have to decide if he would like to go for a general election at some point within this one year. So the rumors now are running in Nagatacho is that if he becomes Prime Minister, he might go for general election very soon, because fresh, new, it doesn't look fresh to me. The Suga's face doesn't look fresh to me now because he's a real successor of Abe. So, but we all know that coronavirus situation will go worse if we go into winter because of flu. Flu is joining to coronavirus. So maybe the situation will get worse. So before the situation gets worse, the election should be held. And the image of this government looks fresh. So that's one scenario. And second scenario is that since Suga boasts that he is a man of coronavirus. I mean, his biggest mandate is to tackle with coronavirus. So there's no time and resource for him to go for election and lose time. So in that case, Suga just goes on and on. And then there will be a leadership competition of the LDP next September, and then new Prime Minister will go for general election. So, and if Suga does a very, very good job, excellent job in tackling with coronavirus, maybe he might think to go for the real term that will start next September. So this is one temporary relief job for him as of now. So the real question comes 1 year from now. And then meanwhile, this 1 year will be a year of factional, the faction politics that has been not been very active under Abe's nearly 8 years ruling. But so it's coming, it's come back, this politics faction. So we will have to look at this, how this go. And finally, I would like to point out that usually in Japan, after long administration, time-wise, there are always a short longevity of some administrations. It was true after the Nakasone era, and true after Koizumi, and then this time around, it's the longest. So unfortunately, I don't think that, this Suga's administration will go for years and years. And so we'll have to brace ourselves for short living administrations, maybe for some time. So, and yes, so that's my observation as of now.
Thank you, Keiko-san. We know that you have to go and broadcast very shortly. So I'm going to ask one question that has been put here on the Q&A. Perhaps you could answer first, and then we will pass to Tobias, where a number of people are interested in, of course, Prime Minister Abe's great ambitions for constitutional reform, revision, including Article 9. So the question is, under his, as you say, successors, because we're not talking about a full successor now, do you think that this ambition is dead? Or in other words, have we passed the peak possibility for constitutional revision and now we will forget about it? Or does it still live on, particularly with Nihon Kaigi and other conservative associations? Have you?
Very good question. Very, very important question. And we don't see as politicians, Japanese politician, as ambitious as Abe in terms of constitutional reform. Ishiba is really ambitious and passionate about the constitutional reform. But unfortunately, he does not have the machine to run. I mean, he is really ambitious and he says a lot of things, but there are not too many people for him to, people who will work for him. That's why he's now losing this time around. And maybe next year, it'll be the same thing for Ishiba, unfortunately. So, and Kishida, he was the man who Abe thought Kishida will bear all the burden and the expectations to continue working on reforming constitution. But since Kishida is now gone, and I think that Suga is not, perhaps will not be denying the road for constitutional reform, but I don't think that, he will make excuse not to work too hard to work on this agenda. This is too big for him, the constitutional reform, because he thinks that coronavirus is the biggest agenda for him. So for 1 year, perhaps it will stall. That's my observation. And so after 1 year, who knows? So back to your question, serious question. I think that this process will stall for at least 1 year, and maybe a couple more years.
Thank you. That's very clear. And we're going to thank you very much, Keiko-san, because
okay. Thank you so much. And, maybe I'll come back maybe sometimes some months later. Okay, see you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, see you again. Thank you so much for
you.
sparing the time. Such a busy evening. Now we're going, Tobias, what is your view about this issue on constitutional reform? And I'm going to connect it with a question that William Horsley has also asked about Mr. Abe's record in office. How is it, in his view, tarnished, or what do you think is tarnished by his association with Nippon Kaigi's campaign, quite a conservative campaign, to censor some of the most troubling aspects of Japan's wartime record, particularly the comfort women issue? And there are other parts of his question, but I'll come back to those. But let's have a look at those two things together, that agenda.
So let's start with the this constitution question. I mean, I certainly agree with what Keiko-san said about, Suga is not going to be in a position over the next year to do anything with that. And we can, and in fact, I hope we talk about just how difficult the next year looks for Suga and really for the Japanese government, and that Abe may be left in the nick of time, because it does not look like an easy year. I will say though, I think there are a few things we've learned, I think, about constitution revision from Abe's tenure. And the first, actually, I mean, we usually talk about it as this legacy of failure. He didn't actually achieve it. It was the one thing he wanted to achieve ever since he entered politics. It was this, dream he inherited from his grandfather, and all of that's true. He did not do it. But what he did do, and I think this started, practically from the moment he entered the Diet all the way up to the present day, is that whatever taboos existed about talking about the Constitution, about constitution revision as being something that is a legitimate item for discussion, and as we saw in 2017, a legitimate item for the Prime Minister to say, here is my proposal for what the Constitution should look like. I am telling my party this is what I would like to see happen. Whatever, the idea now that a Prime Minister couldn't talk about that, or that this is not something that you can even, that the Constitution is sacrosanct. I mean, I think that is done. It is now entirely legitimate. It is now possible for this to be, an issue on the political agenda. There's no question that it will continue to come up in the future as the political agenda allows for it. And so to that extent, looking at the whole arc of his career, I mean, the discussion of the Constitution has changed, I think, irreversibly. The Constitution is no longer a no-go zone. You can now talk about it. I will say, though, the flip side, and I think a big reason why it did not happen under his tenure, and I think the polls bear this out, is that I think a lot of Japanese voters looked at Abe's zeal for constitution revision and said, well, wait a second, if he's, we're not, back off a little bit. You're a little too excited about it. And I think if you looked at polls, I think support for revision in the abstract, without even thinking about the substance of it, should the Constitution be changed, and the respondent could fill that in any number of ways, that support for that generally ran higher than when the question was asked, should the Constitution be revised under Abe's leadership? And the public was very negative on that question, but much more willing to consider the idea that, yes, there are things about the Constitution that should change. And so it's entirely possible that in the future, if Japan ever got to a point where there was nothing else going on and not something more urgent that the prime minister of the day had to deal with, that the parties of Japan could come together and say, there are some issues that we need to address. There are things we think that are missing. There are rights that should be clarified, or maybe Article 9 does need to be clarified, given that you have this this kind of continuing ambiguous situation. And that discussion could happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It might still be a number of years, just because Japan has plenty of other issues to talk about. But I certainly think that's plausible going forward, that everyone's going to agree that maybe this should be dealt with. To the question about Nippon Kaigi, I mean, I'm on the record, both in my book and in other places, of being just skeptical about some of the discussion of Nippon Kaigi's role, and that I think that oftentimes it's believed to be this almost like puppet mastery group, and in some ways, if Nippon Kaigi didn't exist, someone the conservatives would invent it. I mean, they're a pressure group. You have people with this view in Japanese society and within Japanese politics. They have come together in this group, and in fact, in some ways, you look at the membership of which LDP members have joined it. I mean, even someone like Kishida, who is widely seen as a dove, has joined the affinity group among LDP members, suggesting that it's a signaling device, that if you want to show, that kind of do the bare minimum to show voters, oh yeah, I'm a conservative too, you show that you join Nippon Kaigi. But the fact is that, like a lot of pressure groups in Japan and in other democracies, it's shown itself repeatedly to be much better at stopping change that it doesn't want to see. And I think when you look back at 2005, for example, when Koizumi was willing to talk about changing the imperial succession law, possibly to allow women to to inherit the Japanese throne, they mobilized intensely to push back against that. So they have a lot of power to stop things, but the Japanese system allows groups a lot of power to stop things. But the idea that they're able to somehow transform Japan, or that Abe even, that if it wasn't for Nippon Kaigi, he wouldn't believe the things he believed. I think that's just not true. I mean, Abe's beliefs predate the existence of Nippon Kaigi. And in some ways, a group like Nippon Kaigi and that sort of conservative groups in general, I think required having a champion like Abe. And one of the biggest questions, I think, for the LDP going forward is, who exactly is that standard bearer going to be now? And you look at this leadership race, and there were two possible candidates who hinted that they might want to run, and ultimately they didn't run. So there's not really someone from that that group within the LDP running, and there's not an obvious successor to Abe playing in that role as kind of chief conservative within the LDP. And it's a real question going forward. Do they have someone of the stature who, as these leadership elections come in the future, is going to represent that corner of the party? So I'm gonna pause there on that question. But I think we have to be careful when thinking about their influence.
So thank you. That's very clear. And William Horsley is the questioner, and he's a former BBC correspondent in Tokyo and worked with NHK as well. So knows it very well as on the journalistic side. He particularly looked at the comfort women's side, which we know that Prime Minister Abe basically kind of zigzagged on it in some ways. By finding an agreement with President Park and then obviously stumbling during the Moon Jae-in period and everything falling apart. The other point, different point that that William has raised is, were you surprised as a biographer that Prime Minister Abe didn't resign in 2018 following the admission of high-level responsibility for the falsification of official documents to cover up the Moritomo-Gakuen scandal, which directly touched Mr. Abe's family? So, which is a way of asking you, really, how was he a Teflon prime minister through some of these big scandals?
I mean, I think, well, you look at when those scandals occurred, and they bubbled up post 2016, and I think the biggest factor in his stability post 2016 in particular was that I think for many Japanese voters, Abe's argument in the 2017 general election, and to some extent in the LDP leadership election the following year in 2018, was that I am the only leader who's going to be able to keep you safe. You can't trust the opposition. There's no one in the LDP who's going to do it. I'm the one who has the relationship with Trump. I'm the one who's been, who's going to the summits and doing the work. And I have the vision for what needs to be done to keep Japan safe. And I think as the world looked, especially turbulent post 2016, I think that argument really won out. I mean, and I think the arc in 2017, where both scandals kind of Moritomo hits in February, March, and then just as that started to fade from view, you've got the Kakigakwen scandal bursting onto the scene right after that. And then in 2017, in July of 2017, Governor Koike burst on the scene, wins control of the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly, and it looks like, well, okay, you have this new rising power, and Abe's really in trouble. And one factor, wasn't the only factor, but one factor in Abe stabilizing that situation and rebuilding some of his support, and then being in a position to actually call a general election in the fall of that year, was precisely when tensions between the U.S. and North Korea start bubbling up. And suddenly it looks that, we can't possibly continents thinking about another leader at this point in time. And so, and I think Abe was quite deft at projecting that, at repeatedly showing himself to be, a safe, reliable pair of hands. And that it's a dangerous world out there, and it's too dangerous to rely on anyone untrusted.
Another question rather raises that point about how surprising, the point you made about how 7 years ago very few would have suggested that Abe was going to be a long-term prime minister. I mean, a stable prime minister for all that period. What Roberto Wazima Tsatmari has asked, what was it about Abe that made him so good at maintaining stability for so long? And how easy would it be for future prime ministers to replicate that stability? Is he the once in a decade, once every 15 years long-term prime minister that Keiko-san essentially implied, Nakasone the 80s, Koizumi the 2000s, and now Abe? Or was there something about him that, despite his failure in the first term, then meant that he was able to really carry things through?
So, I mean, I play with this question a lot. Is Abe lucky, or is he good? Was it just that the stars aligned and everything worked out? And I mean, I think there are arguments in favor of both. I mean, on the skill side, Abe's all of his political experience, his governing experience, has been in and around the prime minister's office. And had this rare, you've never in post-war Japanese history, never. I guess with the exception of Yoshida, who was briefly out of power and then came back. But under the LDP's history since 1955, have never had a leader leave office and then come back to be prime minister. And he spent the 5 years he was in the wilderness thinking about what went wrong, thinking about how his government functioned, that he was surrounded by politicians who were similar to him, younger, less experienced, maybe headstrong, and who've spent a lot of time fighting with each other instead of, serving Abe and Abe's interests. And he was not well served by the people around him during his first government. There was not a clear message. There was not a clear sense of priorities. He didn't know what he was doing. And I think he would admit that in 2006, he became prime minister significantly prematurely, and that hadn't had enough ministerial experience. So he spent, I think, the 5 years after leaving really thinking about what went wrong, thinking about how to manage personnel affairs better, thinking about economics seriously. I mean, in 2006, he basically didn't have an answer to the questions that voters care about most, which is, is the economy growing and is the pie being distributed fairly? And I think he spent a number of years after that really thinking about that. I mean, you look at his book in 2000 that he put out in 2006 before he becomes prime minister for the first time, and economics are barely mentioned. There's nothing about macroeconomic policy. There's nothing about, what is my job to keep the economy growing? And then, it's all foreign policy and education and these kind of cultural, obsessions, you might say. So, in 2012, he comes back. He's got a much clearer sense of policy priorities. Figures out how to talk about economic policy, where that fits in his vision of making, building a strong Japan. I think he has a much savvier sense of personnel, and part of that is Suga. Anytime you talk about Abe's successes and his successes in government, the fact that Suga was not just the chief cabinet secretary, kind of wandered into the role. He actually there are a number of accounts of the role that he played pushing Abe to run in 2012. That Suga was looking at the map and the landscape as then LDP leader Tanagaki's term was coming to the end, and he convinced Abe, you actually have a real shot at this, and you should do this. And so Suga not only got Abe back in office, but then as chief cabinet secretary masters this art of personnel lineup, figuring out who the right cabinet ministers are to kind of keep rivals within the LDP in the tent. Not causing too much trouble within the party, so that Abe doesn't have to worry about the LDP undermining him, which is a historic problem that LDP leaders have had to face. But then also controlling the bureaucracy. And right behind me, I have Suga's book because I took it off the shelf again. But in 2012, about 6 months before he becomes chief cabinet secretary, writes the book of criticizing the then Democratic Party of Japan and laying out how Japanese government should control the bureaucracy, that you have this wonderful tool, he calls it the world's greatest think tank, at your disposal, but you have to know how to use it. And I think masterfully over the last 8 years, Suga has done that. And, he has controlled the Japanese bureaucracy and made sure that the government was doing something consistent, that Abe was not being undermined, which is not to say that 100% of the time the bureaucracy was behind him, but you had a much more consistent, coherent approach than ever before. And so all of those, I think, reflect skill, Abe's, knowing the right people to have around him, learning the lessons from the past. But then there's also just luck. I think you look at the better part of the decade, not the whole decade, but the better part of the decade, you had an extremely congenial global economic climate, that you didn't have a recession, which made it easier for Japan to, for Japanese exporters to grow. No one was complaining that much that the yen had declined significantly once you get the Bank of Japan introducing extremely loose monetary policy from 2013 onwards. That I think created a climate where Abe just looked good. The economy was growing, the Nikkei was up, land prices were up. Everyone could kind of feel good and happy and confident about the direction Japan was heading. And there, certainly a strong argument, let's not rock the boat too much. And I think the last factor, and this was not Abe's skill at all, and that is, I think the Japanese public was burned out with, I've written a piece a year ago called Japan's Post-Populist Democracy, and that is in the 2000s, during the Koizumi years, and then the rise of the DPJ, you had very intense populist-tinged two-party competition, basically. And in 2005, you have massive turnout, and the LDP wins its biggest landslide ever until 2012. And then in 2009, you have massive turnout the other direction, and the DPJ wins the single largest victory a Japanese party has won since 1945. They win 306 seats. And that was this intense, these waves and surges of political competition, political interest. And all of that was burned out by 2012. And so one factor throughout the Abe years is that in every election, he won 6 national elections, and in all of those elections, you've had either record low or near record low turnout, because I think independents and a lot of voters were just tired and were not interested in being excited. They were just kind of happy to sit back, and maybe they didn't love Abe. I think a lot of them did not love Abe. A lot of them did not love the opposition, which struggled to figure out what it wanted to be during the Abe years. And some of that was due to luck, some of that was due to Abe's skill. But the fact is that this was the democracy that Abe inherited. And as long as things looked mostly okay economically, and Japan's foreign relations were managed competently, there was not any real hunger to change things. And that all worked together to keep Abe around.
No, I agree entirely, particularly about your point about post-populism. One thing, the question that infuriates me more than almost any other in discussions about Japan, why did they escape populism?
Yes.
And the answer is you weren't paying attention. They've been there and they've done that. And they're after it. So I think that's absolutely right. Now let me ask a question about Mr. Suga, looking forward, that Sue Hudson has put up very pertinently. I mean, Mr. Abe, as she said, had some kind of energy and charisma. Stability in international affairs made a difference. He could also speak some English, I think not beautifully and perfectly like Konotaro, but he was actually capable in English. How about Mr. Suga? How will he communicate internationally? How will he go down, do you think, in international relations and in Washington?
I mean, it's the biggest missing piece of his resume. You know, he is someone who is an extremely, I mean, and I think just to step back in the discussion of Suga as a successor, I mean, I think he's been given short shrift in the discussion because it was unclear whether he wanted it, and he's someone who's operated behind the scenes, and so it seemed that, well, maybe he was not best suited. But given the circumstances, given that Japan is in a unusually severe situation economically and with the pandemic, I mean, having an experienced hand as prime minister, I mean, the logic of his candidacy is, I think, compelling. At the same time, though, the one thing that has been missing from his career is that he does not have, I mean, he never, wasn't ever foreign minister, wasn't a defense minister, has not, I mean, this has not been, I mean, as chief cabinet secretary, everything was part of his portfolio. But when you look at the record of policymaking in those areas, that was not where he was most engaged and most active. He does not have the face-to-face diplomatic experience, the relationships with foreign leaders that Abe gained. And Abe had this reputation from the time he entered the Diet as a foreign affairs specialist. When his father was foreign minister, he was his secretary and went on foreign trips with him. I mean, this was part of Abe's identity as a politician. It is not as Suga. He is an insider. He is I have relationships throughout the Japanese political system. I know how the government works, and it's going to be a real challenge. I mean, maybe in the near term, given that there's not that much face-to-face summitry going on right now, it's not going to be the most significant challenge, but he does face some pretty substantial diplomatic challenges ahead of him. I mean, the U.S. election obviously has major implications for Japan, depending on who wins, and what those implications are going to be could differ greatly. You have negotiations coming with the United States on host nation support that are due to start pretty much any day now. There's suddenly a rather significant debate about the relationship with China that had appeared largely settled at the start of the year, and now has been blown open. And I think the China hawks, I think, have the advantage, and relations with South Korea are as bad as they've ever been. And Suga actually has been, in some ways, the face announcing those measures, and most recently in early August, announcing that Japan would retaliate if asset seized from Nippon Steel are liquidated. So he can't ignore foreign affairs in the coming year. It's going to be part of the agenda, even if there's not as much symmetry. And it's a real challenge. And I think he's going to really depend on having a good foreign minister, and he's going to need a good defense minister, because there's also a big discussion about defense policy going on. So in the near term, he's going to depend on good cabinet choices. He does not have, I think, the same English speaking abilities. I mean, and Abe was not perfect, but he was also, Abe was courageous in his willingness to use English, to go into international settings and deliver a speech in English. I don't know if Suga would be able to do that, and what that means then for his relationship, for example, with President Trump, and if President Trump is reelected and at some point they have face-to-face meetings, what those meetings are going to be like, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate too much on that, but I think he will be a very different kind of leader on international affairs.
To be a good golfer with President Trump.
It doesn't seem to be his hobby either. So we'll have to see. He might have to get to work. Exactly.
So, I mean, a couple of people have asked a question which is perhaps a bit unfair to ask you, which is about the UK-Japan trade agreement talks, which are underway and which were scheduled to hopefully complete this month, and so on. Now, I think it is. You may have a view on whether that continues, but I mean, the general question is there continuity in the immediate agenda likelier than change? I suppose we may change the schedule because of a disruptive event like this, but would you expect, in looking at the Japanese political system, really any material change in those sorts of processes that are happening, like a UK-Japan trade agreement?
The continuity is absolutely in the cards, and having the chief cabinet secretary who was there from day one, moving the agenda forward. You're going to, the priorities are going to be the same, and particularly on this question of trade, and I think it's actually worth stressing it. And I wrote in the Nikkei Asian Review the other day about Abe as a globalist, and I think it is absolutely a part of his agenda, of his legacy, stressing a number of these mega trade agreements and prioritizing. Japan needs to advance these 21st century sets of rules, particularly in Asia, but also globally, and particularly given that you have a moribund global trading round that is going nowhere. I mean, Abe essentially has found a backdoor to push that forward. Suga was tremendously involved with that, was tremendously involved with making TPP happen, managing the negotiation from within the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet Secretariat after Japan decided to join the talks in 2013. He also, as part of this kind of globalist agenda, in 2018 was essentially given responsibility for drafting a new work visa program, to open Japan to more foreign workers. It hasn't exactly been successful, and this year, with Japan's borders effectively closed to many countries, it's kind of on hold. But I mean, Suga has, I think, shown even more, perhaps more than Abe, to be an avid believer that Japan's future has to be involved in openness and new global rules and being connected to the world in whole new ways. And so a Suga premiership, I think I'm very confident would continue pursuing that agenda. And as part of that, the Japan UK links are 100% a part of that. And you have to, and of course it's bigger than Abe as well, because there was, Japan pursued these trade agreements for strategic reasons. This was about, not just economic ties, but also making sure that Japan was more closely bound with important partners in the region, but then also globally. So that will definitely carry on.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. The only thing that's changed is the loss of the stability. Yeah. But to some degree, coronavirus and maybe some of the decline of Prime Minister Abe's kind of fortitude, if you like, during this year, maybe had already changed that. To a degree. Now, one question that's lobbed in that it would be interesting to have your brief perspective on is the Womenomics Agenda. Now, clearly, the Japan Society here is going to hear more from me, unfortunately, on this, since I have a book coming out on this. So I won't say too much. But how do you reflect on that, where it sits in, if you like, the Abe agenda, but also the LDP's agenda? Sure. Is it something that will be sustained and accelerated, or is it just like a decorative object?
So I'm, of course, looking forward to your book as well. I mean, it's an extremely important question. And so I don't doubt, I think some people doubt Abe's sincerity in dealing with this, and they point to how many women were in his cabinet, or how many female LDP MPs were elected under his standard, using his coattails. And there were shortcomings, and there were deficiencies, and he had this target early on that you're going to have 30% female executives by 2020, which was not something he was in a position to push through anyway. I think the more important, even more than any targets or numbers that you had to achieve, the most important piece of that agenda actually came later, 2016, 2017, when you started getting a serious discussion of what they called working styles reform. How do the Japanese people work? And that being a huge obstacle to women's advancement in the workplace, and to people starting families. That if there's this expectation, that men are the primary breadwinners, and they have to sit in their seats for extraordinarily long hours, and then they have to go drinking with their office mates afterwards. It is impossible. That is extremely hostile environment for women, and particularly women who are mothers and who have expectations at home, or who have expectations to take care of elderly parents. And that discussion, unfortunately, I don't think it went far enough. But on the other hand, I think you've seen probably more change on that front in the last 6 months than you did in 3 years of reform. And so, so you have this shock. I think there's a lot of discussion of it going forward. I think it is absolutely on the agenda as something that the government needs to do better on. And needs to be willing to discuss this, but also the private sector needs to be willing to join these conversations as well. And I think there's an expectation now, as the world deals with sort of the aftermath of COVID-19, that the way people work, the way people commute, the way, the time people spend in office, do they need to travel as much? All of that, I think, is going to change. And it flows into a discussion that was already happening not satisfactorily, but it was already underway. And so I think just because of that, it will continue regardless of who the prime minister is.
Thank you. Yes, no, I mean, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, I think the work style reform agenda broadly, and particularly the implementation of that big act, is absolutely crucial to it, because this is, in fact, particularly insofar as we're talking about birth rate and work-life balance and all of that, and family formation, is an issue for both men and women. That absolutely needed to be addressed and needs to be addressed going forward. I think that there was probably some tension within the LDP between some of the traditionalist Nippon Kaigi style traditional values about the role of women and this agenda, which may have sometimes complicated the internal politics of it and might indeed have some effect going forward. Now we're running out of time. We're at 2 o'clock. We really ought to stop. I'm just going to simply ask you one final question about China and North Korea, which is really it's almost a question also about the US election. But do you think that, and people have asked this, do you think that the move from a strong, stable leader to a new leader, even if he was already central part of the cabinet, to a short-term agenda, could that lead to any opportunism by China, by North Korea, vis-a-vis Japan? Or are those their opportunistic incentives essentially set in Washington?
Well, with China, I mean, we've already, I think, seen some of that. I mean, we've seen more activity in the East China Sea and around their disputed islands in the East China Sea than in several years, and so that is already on the agenda for a presumptive Prime Minister Suga to deal with, and this question of now globally there's this global reconsideration of China, and maybe that economic decoupling is on the agenda, maybe in ways that in a lot of countries that even before this year hadn't been on, even though the US was starting to talk about it. And I think any big change is going to be on hold until the results of the US presidential election, and seeing how the US is governed and what approach from China you get from Washington. But it's certainly I think figuring out even Japan just debating amongst itself and within the LDP, is there a voice who's going to speak up for finding a way to have a constructive relationship with China, which was the approach that Prime Minister Abe had been taking post 2016, which now has of course gone off the rails. Is anyone willing to speak up for that? And if Toshihiro Nikai is still involved, I mean, he is sort of the leading friend of China in the LDP. He was a major role in getting Suga now to this position of being the presumptive leader. I mean, there's certainly a voice in the senior-most circles of the LDP making that case. But the question is, with everyone on the other side now feeling emboldened and encouraged, and saying now is the time to change the relationship, can a Prime Minister Suga push back against that, find a balance between that? I don't quite know, again, because this is not necessarily the area where he's been most active, and he's going to have to figure that out pretty quickly. And North Korea, I mean, Japan has fallen off the radar screen to a certain extent as far as North Korea is concerned. I mean, as there was this rush of diplomacy, from 2018 onwards, and talks between the U.S. and North Korea, and South Korea and North Korea, and China and North Korea, Japan was isolated in that. And part of that was, Abe's insistence on the abductees. But it's also unlikely that Suga or if other successors in the future are going to be able to necessarily pivot from that. I mean, they're not going to be as personally invested in that issue as Abe was. So maybe there's a little more flexibility, but a lot of the pace of that, of ties with North Korea is going to be set in other capitals in the region. Japan is not going to be the prime mover on that.
No, and we will see perhaps the most immediate reflection of the North Korean issue we may see in defense spending. In other words, in the decision making about missile defense and preemptive strike capabilities. That will be a bit of a test of the way in which, if you like, the new agenda is going to be set. But look, I would like to thank you, Tobias, for giving us so much of your breakfast time in Washington, for giving us a very compelling talk about Shinzo Abe and his legacy, and helping us to understand much better where he came from and where things are going. I wish you all the very, very best with your book promotion and with the book sales, but also there's going to be a lot for you to analyze for your company.
For sure.
And we definitely want to keep in touch, and maybe see you again on a Japan Society London event sometime soon. I could thank Keiko Iizuka if she was still on live, but on behalf of all of the members, I do thank her for sparing the time and being with us. And I thank all the members for your excellent questions, some of which I've tried to sort of blend together in the way in which we
Thank
we'll
you.
Be back. Thank you, Tobias, and we'll be back with more webinars very soon. An announcement will come around as soon as I've set the next ones. Thanks a lot today, and have a great day in Washington.
Thank you.